I'd like to take the opportunity this morning to explore with you some of the core characteristics of science. And I'm going to do this through the lens of biodiversity, and more specifically through the tree of life. So I'm a plant evolutionary biologist. I work at the Florida Museum, and my research expertise is on plant evolution. And so I'd like to share some of these concepts about the nature of science through examples from my own work. And this entails an examination of the tree of life. So before we start talking about science and research, I thought it would be important to trace the concept of the tree of life back through ancient cultures. And really, nearly all ancient cultures had a tree of life concept that explained the origin of life or the relationships among living beings. And those relationships also with the underworld and with the beyond. And so on the left here, we have a diagram of the Assyrian tree of life, which dates back 6,000 years. And on the right, the Maya tree of life, which dates back approximately 2,000 years, just as a couple of examples. Now in science, the concept of the tree of life as a way of organizing what we know about biodiversity traces back to Plato. And on the left, we have the scala naturae, or the ladder of being, or the great chain of being, which is the way that Plato, Aristotle, and their students thought about how to organize the diversity of life around them. And this, of course, is not a tree, it's a ladder, but it's an organizing principle that basically shows increasing complexity of life with humans at the apex or at the top. Now, this sort of view of biodiversity was really the way that people thought about life for almost 2 centuries, and really until the 1800s. Now, on the right, we see an interesting pre-Darwinian view of life and how it might be organized, in this case by Edward Hitchcock, through the lens of geology. So we see different forms of life tracing back to different geological time periods. Now, everything in biology changed dramatically with Darwin and the theory of evolution. So as early as 1837, Darwin was sketching out his ideas about how organisms were related to each other in some sort of family tree. And you can see this in the little sketch from Darwin's notebook there in the center. And then in The Origin of Species, published in 1859, he wrote, "The affinities of all beings of the same class have sometimes been represented by a great tree. I believe this simile largely speaks the truth." And this figure below that quotation is the only figure in the entire Origin of Species. And it shows his thinking about common ancestry and branching points and the origins of new species. And he put all of this into the context of a large family tree that represents all species that are currently alive and that have ever lived. Oops. Now, biologists have continued to refine our understanding of the tree of life ever since Darwin. So for example, on the left, we see Ernst Haeckel, who was a zoologist from Germany, and a beautiful diagram that he used to convey his concept of the tree of life. And this was a field of endeavor that really exploded quite quickly after Darwin's publication of The Origin. But today we continue as a large international community to try to refine our understanding of the tree of life. And today we use, for living species, mostly DNA data. And the figure on the right is taken from a paper that was published a few years ago that is meant to represent all main groups of organisms, with the eukaryotes being down to the right and all of the prokaryotic diversity sort of scattered in an arc around the top. So I think this brief introduction illustrates some of the characteristics of science that we'll explore further through the next few minutes. So really, what is science? Well, science is both knowledge about and the process of studying the natural world. So an emphasis here on the natural world. It's also evidence-based, it's testable, it changes with new evidence, and it's reproducible. So let's unpack these statements. Now, as I mentioned, I study plant diversity, and one of my goals is to take all of the plant diversity, about 500,000 species of plants, and try to understand how that diversity is organized in a family tree that goes back to the beginning of the plant branch, maybe about 1 billion years or so ago. So we take this diversity and we try to convert it into a family tree, which is what you can see on the right. And you can think of this as sort of Darwin's tree of life, but switched onto its side. Now, the evidence that we use has changed over time. And over 100 years ago, if you look at the figure on the left, this is sometimes called Bessie's cactus. This is one of the first depictions of the family type relationships in flowering plants. And it looks sort of like a cactus. And this represents really the intuition that the scientist Charles Bessie had about how different groups were related. And of course, it was based on morphology, the overall shape and structure of the plants. Now, this is the sort of approach that was used for the next 50 years or so. And by 1981, we have Cronquist's view here in the center, the sort of bubble diagram that shows his concept of relationships, also intuitive, but it doesn't take into account only morphology. It also uses things like plant anatomy, plant biochemistry, chromosome numbers, and other sorts of evidence. And it provides a refined version of the hypotheses that went before. And then on the right, we have, again, this phylogenetic tree or this evolutionary family tree that shows how we currently understand relationships based on molecular sequence data. So science is based on evidence, but that evidence can change through time. Now, science is also testable. And I think one thing that we need to keep in mind at all times is that our scientific conclusions are really hypotheses for the next round of experiments. So this diagram here shows sort of a complex version of Cronquist's view of flowering plant relationships. And the only things I want to point out are that some groups are labeled in blue and some groups are labeled in green. The blue groups are those groups that would fall under dicots, the green groups under monocots. And I'm sure everybody is familiar with these terms. These are terms that have long been with us as a way of classifying the flowering plants. So this is a hypothesis. All family trees like this are hypotheses. And so we wanted to test this, we as a large community, using molecular data. So we add DNA sequences, we add some computation, and we want to see what sorts of results come out of that. Do they support this long-standing hypothesis about the split between the dicots and the monocots? And in fact, if we look at this result published in 1993 by a group of 43 authors, we see that the monocots do form a group, but the dicots don't. And if you think back to what you might have learned about monocots have a single cotyledon, they have all of their parts in threes. The dicots, there's some variation there. And certainly when we look at how the dicots are spread across this tree, we can see that the dicots don't really form a group. So if this is true, if they really don't form a group, then we shouldn't refer to them anymore. And in fact, all of our data over the past over 20 years, 25 years or so now, indicate that the dicots are no longer a group we should recognize, and therefore we should not teach about it. That's just a little pet peeve and a little soapbox, so I'll get off of that now. So scientific knowledge changes with new evidence. So now we know that we don't want to recognize the dicots as a group in our taxonomy because it doesn't represent the product of evolution. And as we compare the diagram on the left with these two diagrams that were published just last year, we can see not only that this idea of the monocots being a group and the dicots not is upheld, but there are other sorts of changes that, that we now acknowledge. So scientific knowledge changes as we have new evidence. Also, science is reproducible. So if I were to download DNA sequences from GenBank at NCBI and to sit at my computer and analyze the data in a particular way, in the same way that the authors of the tree on the right did, I would get that same tree. And what happens here is that scientists are trying always to be explicit about the work that they do and explain it in a way that it can be repeated and validated. And so reproducibility is really one of the things that sets science apart from many other endeavors. So again, the same gene sequences analyzed in the same way should give the same tree. And there's really currently a strong emphasis on open science and reproducibility. But science can't answer all questions. Science is appropriate for certain types of questions, but not others. So science does not make aesthetic judgments. It can't tell us what's beautiful. We can use the beauty of art to help us convey scientific principles, but the science can't tell us that the art is beautiful or not. Likewise, science can't help us make moral judgments. It may give us background information, but it can't tell us how to use the knowledge. So for example, should scientists use CRISPR to increase crop yield? Science can help us understand CRISPR technologies and how we might want to apply it for certain sorts of applications, but science does not tell us whether or not it's appropriate. And science does not address the supernatural. And just by definition, supernatural means outside of nature. So there are certain things that science can tell us and certain things that science can't. And included in the latter are issues of faith. Now, I'd also like to point out that not all focused thought is science. There's a lot of scholarly effort that's also devoted to many other areas, such as ethics or the arts or theology and religion. And so we wouldn't want to think that only science is rigorous and scholarly. Other areas also experience the same sort of devoted effort. And finally, I'd like to comment on the fact that science is a human endeavor and that the inferences are influenced by the experiences of the scientists. So scientists carry their own biases, and this is one reason why science scholars are now recognizing the value of teams in scientific projects. So team science, particularly teams made up of diverse groups, can help to look at a problem from a number of different perspectives. And what this means is that the conclusions are less likely to be biased by a single perspective or point of view, and more likely to incorporate a much broader view or perspective on whatever the scientific problem might be. Now, the other thing, though, about science being a human endeavor is that there may be differences of opinion. And these differences of opinion may be expressed in different ways by different scientists. Often there can be sort of fads in how we analyze data or in thoughts, and these may be led by whoever has the loudest voice, whoever is the biggest person and takes up the most room in a conference. All sorts of things can lead to sort of dominant theories or hypotheses in science. But it's also possible that different points of view and different interpretations can actually lead to new discoveries. And this is what happens when scientists have valuable dialogue rather than continue to push sort of divergent points of view. So I have these two diagrams here, and these represent some really complex biological information, but we just need to focus on a couple of different things. So on the diagram on the left, group 1 and group 2 are closest relatives. But on the diagram on the right, groups 2 and groups 3 are closest relatives. The diagram on the left was built with DNA sequences from the chloroplast genome, and the diagram on the right was built with data from both the nuclear genome and the mitochondrial genome. So at first, when groups of scientists came up with these two competing hypotheses, there was a little bit of this, no, I'm right, no, I'm right, back and forth, and at conferences, a little bit in the literature. But in fact, when scientists started looking at this problem together, it became clear that in fact, it wasn't one group being right and the other group being wrong. Both groups are actually right. And what we have now inferred happened is that there was an ancient event of hybridization that brought the data, brought the gene sequences together. And so both of these diagrams are actually right. The chloroplast tree is right, the nuclear and mitochondrial tree is right. And if scientists had continued to argue about what was right and rather than thinking about things collaboratively, we would have never had this essentially paradigm shift about the ancestry of this really prominent group of flowering plants. So I hope I've been able to help demonstrate just a little bit that science is both knowledge about the natural world and also the process of studying the natural world. It's evidence-based, it's testable, it changes with new evidence, and it's reproducible. And with that, I'll say thank you very much for your attention.